Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are coming in from. We are here today for this ENSULIB webinar. ENSULIB is IFLA's Environmental Sustainability and Library section. And today's webinar is Centering Degrowth in Assessing Environmental Sustainability in Libraries. I'm going to share a little of the blurb about today's talk. In order to avoid the worst possible outcomes of the climate crisis, it may not be possible to focus on the triple bottom line of society, environment, and economic growth all at the same time. This system extends the delusion that we can continue the way we currently are in society in the relentless race toward progress and limitless growth without ill effects on people and the planet. Libraries are situated as bastions of degrowth based upon a circular economy and social equity. This session explores modes of degrowth assessment accessible to all libraries and library workers, including Indigenous methods, true cost assessment, and sustainability tracking assessment and rating system, known as STARS. Participants, we hope, will leave this session with resources to begin measuring and communicating the impact of their work related to environmental sustainability. My name is Beth Filer-Williams. I'm on the standing committee for ENSULIB section, and I'm also a user experience research librarian at Oregon State University Libraries. And I'm representing IFLA, and a little bit about what IFLA's ENSULIB is. We encourage libraries to inspire their communities in more environmental sustainable ways by providing materials on green librarianship and giving voices to you all, like globally. We do a lot of projects from like the webinars today that we record. There's many that we've recorded that are online, and we do events and conferences. But we have so many online materials. We have them translated in many languages. You can help us. If you know a language you'd like to help us translate into, please reach out. We are working on a book that's coming out soon called Libraries Driving Education for Sustainable Development. We have Green Library tools and posters, and we do the Green Library Award for IFLA. So lots of projects. You don't have to be a part of the standing committee in order to help. So if you're interested, reach out. You can also sign up to receive our newsletter that comes out every 6 months. And maybe you have something you would like to share in the newsletter as well.
All right, so I'm going to jump in, and my name is Vivian Bird, and I am currently a public librarian for the Los Angeles Public Library, leading our system-wide STEM and neighborhood science initiatives. My biggest job is really to promote sustainability and also in terms of the programming in the library. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information about the event. So about our webinar series here, this event is being recorded except for the breakout rooms, including chats. The video will be posted on YouTube, and the link will be posted on ENSULIB's webpage and on Facebook. The chat and the Q&A proceedings will not be recorded nor published. Microphones will have been muted for this event. And if you have any comments, please feel free to type in the chat. For any Q&As, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the menu bar to ask any questions, to share any questions you have for our speakers, and the session will follow the presentation. If you have any questions regarding privacy, please email professional support at ifla.org. And the talk is GDPR compliant. IFLA and Zoom privacy policy, you can find that on in the link, from the link in the on our screen. All right, and I'm going to hand this back to Beth, who is going to introduce our awesome speaker today.
Great. Now for the reason that you're really here, let me introduce Nicole. I saw her present at another conference and just was blown away by what she was talking about. And she got the whole room, the people in the room talking, and that was just amazing to see. So Nicole Doro is an uninvited settler living and working on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. She is a teaching and learning librarian at McMaster University, where she co-chairs McMaster's Library Sustainability Committee, and her research interests include climate action in the academic libraries and open access. So go ahead and share your slides and take it away, Nicole.
Hi, everyone. Okay, going into presentation mode, here we are. Thank you so much for joining me from all around the world and in so many different time zones. I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. So I'll begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Mississauga nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster University, where I work, and Hamilton, Ontario, where I live, the traditional inhabitants of this land. Wherever it is that we're joining from, we must acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us to recognize our responsibility as guests to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. This work of climate action and climate justice must be premised upon recognizing and uplifting those who have been doing this work for centuries. So if you like, in the chat, I know we've all been saying hello from where we're from. But I thought I'd open up as well just to give a moment to see if anyone knows anything about the traditional inhabitants of the land wherever you are joining from today. So if you'd like to take your time and add a note there in the chat, you're welcome to do so. And you could also just reflect on it on your own or do some own investigations on your own if you like as well. Just an invitation to reflect upon it for a moment. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the lands where I'm joining from, because I think it relates to our session today, and specifically to the work of climate action that I know we're all interested in, and that's the reason we're joining this session today. So Leanne Bedesamosake Simpson is a Mississauga Anishinaabe writer and musician and a member of the Alderville First Nation. Her book, Nupaming, The Cure for White Ladies, weaves together stories of 7 main characters who represent ancestors, spirits, animals, and people, all referred to with they, them pronouns, that simultaneously represent multiplicity and union. McMaster stands on Between the Lakes Treaty Number 3 land, which is a part of the same Upper Canada land surrenders where the Nupaming book is set. And I just would like to read you a small excerpt from a chapter of this book. The chapter is called Formation, and it's about a group of Canada geese reflections on lessons from their own migration. Here's a quote from the book. They see formation, as a singular organism propelling itself someplace else whose magnificence is bigger than the sum of its parts. Mandaminakug's responsibility is to observe the function of the system as a whole, to take note of inconsistencies and weaknesses, to watch how the system generates and uses energy, copes with and minimizes drag and friction, and responds to the constantly changing variables of wind, temperature, moisture, and light. Sure, the formation is made up of individuals, and individuals are formations in and of themselves. But that is the trick, to not get caught up in one's own body, one's own experience, one's own cycling head. Synergy matters because it represents the incomprehensible, the other forces and nations working with you, even if you're unaware. To me, this passage is so important in our present times of political and systematic division. While we're seeing climate data erased, funding for programs for climate justice like affordable cooling and energy transitions dismantled, it's really easy to get caught up in feelings of hopelessness and despair. This text invites us to look around at mutual aid, at grassroots efforts like what we're working on today, what we're all working on in our own libraries, community-led actions where we can still make a difference, where we still have our own scope of influence. For some of us, our own individual practices of acknowledging the land and acting in solidarity with Indigenous peoples could include mindfulness in your own interactions with land and nature, writing or speaking to members of government to demand action, reading or learning more about Indigenous culture, history, and our current political landscapes. Whichever action you'd like to take, let it be grounded in this concept of formation. I'd like to end the land acknowledgement by inviting you, if you like, to share some resources for Indigenous land stewardship initiatives, whether that be through attention, volunteering, signal boosting, sharing funds, or whatever actions suit your own strengths, passions, and available resources. As Leanne Simpson writes in Nupaming, think about what kind of log the fire needs. I'm going to share one that I really like that's local to my area in the chat there, just to kind of give you an example of something, again, something that I like to kind of come back to when I'm feeling helpless in this moment of climate action, and I can kind of send some resources where it matters. So, okay, I'm going to move on now to our agenda for our session at hand. I'm going to start today with an introduction to the climate crisis, particularly in a lens of degrowth. I know everyone here is very familiar with the climate crisis. We'll talk a little bit about climate action in libraries and what that kind of state of the union currently is. And we'll do a really brief introduction to assessment, just because I know folks might be joining from various areas in the library and may not have thought about assessment too much in your roles. I'll talk a lot about degrowth and, oops, there we go. And then finally, we'll move into the more practical realm of some examples of assessments that are premised upon degrowth. Okay, so just as means of an introduction, like I said, I know this is IFLA's ENSULIB, and so the odds are that most of us here are very familiar with the climate crisis. But in particular, I think these graphics, these graphs that are displayed on the page here, depict why degrowth is so important to the climate crisis. So these graphs are all from the New York Times. The graph on the top left corner shows our current emissions trajectory. This is planetary. So our high path, our low path, we're hovering around 60 billion metric tons of CO2. In order to get to what we've pledged for the Paris Agreement, we would be looking at reducing our CO2 emissions to between like 50 and 55 billion metric tons of CO2 per year. And I just want to note, we're really struggling to even meet that goal. We're already there, and we're nowhere near where we need to be. And now finally, this graph in the middle, it's yellow. This shows the reduction we'd need in our planetary CO2 emissions to stay below 2 degrees of warming, which is what the scientists at the Interplanetary Climate Commission have recognized as, again, avoiding the worst possible outcomes of the climate crisis. We would need to almost half what our current emissions are. And so I think one way I like to think about this in my own life and in my own work is like, what would it take for me to cut by half what I'm already using, doing, et cetera? And so there's a really, I think it just helps to invite us to think about like what would actually really be required systematically in our lives in order to get to that level where we need to go. And that's really where degrowth comes in. Okay, so I'm going to move on now. We're going to talk a little bit more about degrowth as we progress, but I just want to move back to the library lens in particular. So all jobs are climate jobs now. And so as a society, we really need to reduce emissions, which we can refer to, or is sometimes referred to as climate mitigation. And we also need to support those who are disproportionately affected, which is where climate adaptation and climate justice come in. I'll come back to those terms in a minute. So how can we know if we're making things better if we haven't measured our actions or the impacts of our actions in the first place? And that's the piece related to assessment. So when we're addressing climate change through library work, ALA and Sustainable Library Initiative have recently, in the past year, issued this climate action strategy for libraries, and it's a really good place to start. Their definition of these terms, climate change mitigation, which is really just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, climate change adaptation, which is increasing community resilience to the impacts of the climate change, and climate justice work, which is acknowledging the climate crisis impact on marginalized communities. And there's lots of examples of the way that this work is already being borne out in libraries. So I'm joining from Canada today, so I've included some examples that I'm acutely familiar with in Canada. We have the Canadian Federation of Library Associations, CFLA, a climate action committee there. We have a Canadian Association of Professional Academic Librarians, Climate Action Community of Practice, which is a group of librarians in Canada that just meet once a month, and we kind of talk about what we're doing in our own libraries and our own communities, share ideas and resources. And there's lots of provincial groups as well. So there's the Ontario Library Association and British Columbia Library Association. Each also have climate action communities of practice and committees as well. Addressing climate change through library work in an international context, I've again just added a couple that I'm familiar with and aware of, but I know there's so many folks joining from places that you'll probably have much better examples of the way that these kind of communities of practice come together. So if you would like to share in the chat, I know I think everyone here would love to see what's going on, in other countries and other regions. So if you know of any others, please feel free to add in the chat there as well. So I've noted ALA Sustain RT Roundtable is doing incredible work, and obviously IFLA's ENSULIB section is an incredible resource as well to have. Okay, so now, and just like I said, a really brief introduction to what assessment is. So I'm not an assessment librarian. I'm a teaching and learning librarian. But the way that I came to assessment is from my work in sustainability. So I founded and I co-chair the McMaster Library Sustainability Committee, and I was really fortunate to receive some grant funding from some funding available at McMaster. And part of the conditions of the grants were to kind of have built-in assessments for the programs and initiatives that we were running. And so that was kind of my first in my introduction to thinking about this. And so in case anyone else like me is working in an area of the library, or maybe working in public libraries, and your job doesn't regularly include assessment, I thought I would introduce it a little bit here. So just so you have a sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about assessment. So really what we're looking to do is to determine the needs of the library patrons and our communities, and how well our library is really meeting those needs, what we can do to improve. So it can include elements like really high up, kind of, I guess, bottom down thinking. So something like strategic planning. And it could also include like bottom up thinking. So really interacting with our users, our collection statistics, for me in teaching and learning, assessing the ways our kind of learning objects are being used, and implementing some sort of qualitative or quantitative methodologies to check in with our users and to check in with our services and our programs, just to make sure they're meeting their mark. And really, it's a really valuable tool to communicate the impact a library is having in a community, and this can really help with resourcing. So, like I said, in the way in my job, I see this as sometimes when I'm talking about teaching statistics, so like time spent with classes and students or consults, it can help with asking for like other staffing help with our sustainability committee. I was able to advocate for a small budget to help support some of our committee initiatives. And so thinking about assessment and building it into the work that we're doing is a way that we can kind of, communicate our impact to administrators, but also to our community as well, just to say, here's what we're doing, and here's the value of what we're doing. And it helps kind of sustain the work of the library as well. So now we're going to talk about it a little bit in the lens of sustainability work in the library. So by means of talking about growth in sustainable assessment, I'm going to start by talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, so the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So it's one of the most popular modes of assessing sustainability, I would say even beyond libraries, but particularly in libraries, I've noticed it in the literature. So in 2015, just an introduction if you're not familiar with it, the United Nations adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which centers 17 goals that are meant to simultaneously recognize and inspire action on targets related to health, education, inequality, economic growth, and climate change. These United Nations Sustainable Development Goals categorize and rank progress within and between countries based on the 17 goals. It is modeled on the premise of the triple bottom line, so social, environmental, and economic facets. Before I bring in a few criticisms of the SDGs, I do want to just note, I don't want to say that I'm that they're just this like evil force that are doing no good at all. That's not what the point of this is. I'm specifically talking about the problem with building in growth to our assessment in libraries. So I do just want to mention, the SDGs are incredible at breaking down a wicked problem, so a problem that has many moving parts into more manageable parts. we're not all experts at everything. And so it can be really overwhelming to like think about the whole issue of the climate crisis and all of the intersecting parts of it. And so when we break this big problem into smaller scopes, it can be an invitation to kind of get involved about in the areas in which we do know something and which we can move the needle and make a difference. So, you know, I have to note that. And in particularly in the library context, it's a really useful point of metadata for searching. So I know, for instance, Scopus has a search filter where you can search for resources based on the SDG that they're related to. So it's really great to be able to kind of, you know the area that you're working within and then search for progress or what's happening in that particular area too. And that's a really useful tool for scientific communication for sure. Now I will talk a little bit about how the growth facets that are built into the SDGs, where I see them not really delivering or helping us in a kind of meaningful way. So as a form of assessment, there's implicit bias in the SDGs since assessment is reported by national statistics offices and not externally verifiable in many ways, when they're reported at all. The 2024 UN SDG Progress Report noted only 135 of the 169 targets can be assessed due to insufficient data. Comparing the data of one country to another is not comparing like to like, because as Andreas Malm points out in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, not all emissions are equal. There's a difference between luxury versus subsistence emissions. As such, to follow a scheme of data tables without context that would compare greenhouse gas emissions of richest nations and their luxury emissions associated with private jets, yachts, and numerous mansions against poorest nations and their cattle or rice paddy emissions that compromise the nation's livelihood is morally reprehensible. Beyond the issue of data scarcity is inequity, and some of the definitions for data collection are also inadequate. The definition for poverty currently defined as surviving on less than $2.15 per person per day, and that's USD. The UN SDGs do not explicitly mention Indigenous populations or colonization and its ill effects. And while the UN noted that Indigenous peoples are at the heart of the 2030 Agenda, marking this population as an implicit inspiration, only 6 direct references to the world's Indigenous population does not do enough to make explicit the fact that the populations most at risk from the climate crisis are the world's most vulnerable communities, the same communities who least contributed to the climate crisis to begin with. The premise of the triple bottom line upon which the UN SDGs is based is capitalist in nature, and no inherently capitalist system can solve the climate emergency in a meaningful way. As Andreas Malm notes again in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, we find ourselves between 2 scissor blades. On the one hand, unbending business as usual, taking emissions ever higher and confounding hopes for mitigation. And on the other, delicate ecosystems crashing down, the extraordinary inertia of the capitalist mode of meeting new activity here. When considering the USDG data for any given nation's individual goals and their progress, generally the positively trending goals are related to capitalism, which have an inverse relationship to goals to human rights and climate change. For example, to be improving on Goal 8, which is decent work and economic growth, or Goal 9, which is industry, innovation, and infrastructure, it often comes at the expense of progress on Goal 12, which is responsible consumption and production. It may not be possible to focus on the triple bottom line of society, environment, and economic growth all at the same time. Adapting the system of belief and assessment extends the delusion that we can continue the way that we currently are in a society in a relentless race towards progress, with limitless growth without ill effect on people and the planet. Malm states, this is the impasse in which the climate movement finds itself. The historical victory of capital and the ruination of planet are one and the same thing. There is another way. There are other modes of economic growth that we can think of. So looking to social and planetary health economist, for example, Kate Raworth, who writes, today we have economies that need to grow whether or not they make us thrive. What we need are economies that make us thrive whether or not they grow. Boundless growth year over year, return on investment, and value for shareholders would not be possible to make the type of strong headway we need to stave off the worst possible outcomes of the climate crisis. The triple bottom line of social, environmental, and economic sustainability may be impossible to obtain in a capitalist society. In a circular economy, like the way our libraries function, that doesn't measure boundless growth as success, perhaps economic sustainability could be in balance with the social and environmental sustainability, but with the system as it currently stands, it's doomed to fail. Okay, so the problem of the SDGs, specifically as they apply to libraries now, we can see that it's pretty easy to look at what we're already doing in libraries and map our activities to the UN SDGs and kind of give ourselves a gold star for what we're doing without really making any full meaning change on our day-to-day activities. So the SDGs are an easier target to meet than to do the work of assessing and reducing emissions or assessing and increasing actions towards climate change. So an example of this is my colleagues at the University of Toronto, Janaea Webb and Nicole Slattery, found that only 11 out of 31 Canadian Association of Research Libraries member institutions had environmental and climate-related content through the library's websites, policies, or strategic plans. Yet 30 out of 31 demonstrated commitments that aligned with at least Goal 4, which is quality education, Goal 10, which is reduced inequalities, or Goal 13, which is climate action. And the inverse is also true, and not really in a great way. It's tempting to think that we might not be able to have an impact on a particular goal where in fact we could. For instance, it would be reasonable for a library mapping their activities to think that they would not be able to impact Goal 14, which is life underwater. However, through climate action that made a meaningful reduction in emissions, the rise in temperature would slow, which would result in the ocean's rise in temperature also to slow, which means there's an indirect link to that goal. So it's possible to conduct these thought experiments with each of these goals, given the interconnected nature of the UN SDGs. This interconnection is, as I mentioned earlier, a strength of the UN SDGs, but when we're really mapping the nuance of the sustainability at large, and it comes to quantifying measurably and assessing the impacts of what we are doing, and more importantly, what we can do, that nuance can obscure the larger goal of curtailing the climate crisis. So now I'd like to talk about a language of refusal. Sam Knights, who is a founder of Extinction Rebellion, which is a climate action group founded in the UK with chapters around the world now, writes that more and more people are joining this movement as they realize that the climate crisis and the associated crisis of capitalism and colonialism that caused it will not be solved by gradual reform and rotten compromise. This is a crisis that requires radical system change on a scale never seen before. The problem is our complete and utter failure to imagine any meaningful alternative. As such, rather than simply stating that I think we ought not to use the UN SDGs or any other growth-based form of assessment in libraries, I'd like to point you in the direction of some alternative means of assessment that are not built upon or otherwise entwined with economic measures of success, and instead center on the concept of degrowth. So to turn from the status quo, which is to use the triple bottom line, it might be helpful to first learn and familiarize ourselves with the language of refusal. When there's a measure or status quo approach, as with climate action based on the UN SDGs, to do or propose something else ascertains the status of refusal. In Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, she writes that refusing productivity and stopping to listen entails an active process of listening that seeks out the effects of racial, environmental, and economic injustice and brings about real change. What I'm proposing here is to refuse what may seem at face value like a common sense approach to climate conscious assessment in favor of a more nuanced approach that takes into account the local context and embeds climate justice into our measurements. Odell writes that what is needed is not a once and for all type quitting, but an ongoing training. The ability not just to withdraw attention, but to invest it somewhere else, to enlarge and proliferate it, to improve its acuity. It is in this spirit of reinvesting in our attention to climate action that I offer you the following alternatives. I'll note that it's possible and preferable to adopt elements from each form of assessment, depending on the context of what goals, programs, or services that your library is offering. I'm not advocating for a whole integration of any one of these approaches, or I'm not prioritizing or ranking any of these systems over the other. I'm just offering some alternatives here. Ideally ones that don't solely rely on and just start or end with the UN SDGs or growth in particular. So here are, without further ado, some other forms of assessment that we can think to incorporate. The first one I'd like to offer is the sustainability tracking assessment and rating system, so otherwise known as STARS. So folks that are working in the higher education context, particularly in North America, might be familiar with ASHE, which the acronym is escaping me right now. But the STARS tracking system is related to, I think it's American Association of Sustainability in Higher Education is what ASHE stands for. And so STARS was developed and maintained by ASHE, and the first version of STARS rating was published in 2007. The checklist has been updated. Thanks, Beth. Beth just added the link in the chat. It's been updated over the years, with the most recent iteration launched in June 18th, 2024, so pretty recently. The checklist is entirely open access, and the scoring operates on incremental binary or tiered system, and each goal has a minimum requirement to earn full points. Now, some items on the checklist might not apply to all libraries, again, knowing there were initially written and geared toward higher education institutes. But when we look at what some of the items that are entailed on there are, we can see how adaptable they are to any type of library. So for instance, the ones that are more associated with higher education at large might be ones related to undergraduate programs with sustainability focused learning requirements. So those might not be, related to every type of library. We can kind of pick a la carte the items that are relatable to our library. So for instance, direct units of measure attached to potable water use per person, energy consumption per square meter, greenhouse gas emissions inventory and disclosure, and support for open access publishing. None of the STARS checklist depends on growth or financial progress year over year, and the most recent iteration of STARS includes more robust indicators of racial equity and social justice. This is evident from the categories devoted to social equity, like supports for students from underrepresented groups, percentage of employees with marginalized gender identities, numbers of weeks of paid maternity leave, percentage of employees that receive a living wage. Again, these are items that are relevant to any of our workplaces. The commitment to people and planet over financial gain sets STARS apart from many other programs and forms of sustainable assessment. So an example of how we're using this system or something like it, adapting it a little bit in my library context in the Sustainability Committee, is we are currently working on a project that is measuring the energy use of our library's digital systems. So we have our power racks in the basement of our library, one of our library buildings, and another kind of central location where we have hired an electrician to come in and plug in some energy monitoring equipment and give us kind of some benchmark totals of the energy that we're using. And so we're going to remeasure incrementally over time to make sure that, as we're bringing more systems online or moving towards digital systems in our libraries, our energy system and even the energy mix that we're using. So, what share of our energy use is gas, what energy use is electric, et cetera, depending on the time of day of use. And then we're contextualizing that within the STARS report from our larger institution. And we're just going to kind of issue some recommendations for library staff, library employees that will help, minimize energy use as much as possible. And so that way we're not kind of, we can make sure that we're not, as our library, as our campus grows, our energy use isn't just kind of exploding upwards, and that we're kind of keeping an eye on it as we go further. So that's just one example of how we're using it, but there's many different ways this could be adapted. And so I think it would be great if you wanted to take a look at the STARS list and see what's relevant to you in your library. Another form of assessment that isn't based on growth is true cost accounting, which aims to find monetary value of product beyond market value and adds the dimension of cost for environmental and social impacts of a product or service to its face value. So for example, if you go to the store and you look at the price tag that's on, say, a shirt, you see the cost of the shirt. That is what you would have to pay to the store to buy the shirt. True cost assessment would add into that cost the materials that the shirt is made with, the cost to the planet of shipping that shirt to that store, how the employees that made that shirt were treated, and what conditions were there. Because often we find clothes that are really inexpensive, it's because that expense is coming at the expense of the people who made the shirt, or the planet and the materials that it costs to produce that shirt, or our technology, or things like that, et cetera. And so there's a kind of a flipped value there, where it can cost a lot more sometimes to make sure that we're, you know, paying living wages to people that are producing the products that we're consuming. And true cost accounting is looking to kind of add those costs. So it's kind of multi-dimensional means of accounting that isn't based purely on market value. So while true cost accounting does technically have an economic component to it, the premise is to add social and ecological dimensions to existing financial accounting procedures for organizations. In this way, it is a form of assessment that does not necessarily depend on perpetual financial growth as a pillar, but instead challenges the status quo of modern capitalism and accounting to look at costs beyond the monetary. For example, a case study from Bebington and Laringa highlights a 2010 report from Spanish Railways that documented saving 297 million euros in diverted costs due to reductions in air pollution, carbon emissions, and noise that would have otherwise been expanded due to travel. When considering the costs of acquiring collections or licenses in our library, for example, true cost accounting would look beyond the monetary value of the product and add dimension to the cost in terms of greenhouse gas emissions for shipping or for data storage in the case of ebooks or e-resources. But it could also account for downstream social costs saved, such as the number of loans denoting the number of copies of a book that were saved from unique purchases, and the costs associated per book. So for instance, thinking about the planetary costs for paper and ink and that kind of thing. And finally, this is the most kind of amorphous recommendation I have for you, because it's very dependent on your local context. So this kind of goes back to my land acknowledgement at the beginning, and my invitation to each of you to consider the lands in which you're joining from. But we really need to recognize that Indigenous peoples all around the world have centuries of ancestral knowledge that come primarily from observing the nature that surrounds them, which is the original form of climate resilience and preparedness. Hindu Umararu Ibrahim writes, Indigenous peoples are the guardians of ancestral knowledge that draws from the environment the solutions of everyday life. These solutions are priceless. It is a treasure for all of those who have to face climate disorders because it helps them cope with the worst of its consequences, such as droughts, floods, hurricanes. In the Pacific Islands, Indigenous people transmit from generation to generation the varieties of edible plants that can feed an entire people after a typhoon, and so allow them to survive when all crops are destroyed. In the Sahel, the Enders know which source continues to flow at the worst time of droughts. In tropical forests, Indigenous peoples know which plants best to protect against the epidemic diseases such as malaria or dengue fever. Indigenous peoples are also the ones who best protect nature because it is their work tool. In the heart of tropical forests, it is in the areas populated by hunter-gatherer communities that we can find the most biodiverse areas. In the Sahel, annual transhumance contributes to the natural fertilization of soils, and this developing a green wall that prevents desertification. In coastal areas from Central America, Kuna, to the Pacific Maori, traditional fishing methods preserve corals, mangroves, and other unique ecosystems that are the most effective barrier to rising sea levels. So the most key component to following this framework set out by Indigenous knowledge is a method of inquiry to assess our impact in the library, and it requires room to observe. So what measures we gain when we input quantitative statistics would be enriched with the context if we build in time to reflect on our processes and remark upon them, and the patterns that we're observing and how these patterns may differ from seasons past. And this, as I mentioned at the introduction of this one, it's the least prescriptive form of assessment because it's necessarily local. There's not a single way to adopt the framework because it's built between each library and the Indigenous peoples that were original inhabitants and stewards of the land. The needs of a library's community in a fire-prone area will vary greatly from the needs of a library community in a flood-prone area, a drought-prone area, an urban heat island, and so on. Integrating local Indigenous knowledges into assessments for a library's climate impact lends itself particularly well to the climate justice and climate change preparedness facets of the ALA SLI definition of climate action. So again, a kind of example of how the McMaster Library Sustainability Committee incorporates Indigenous knowledge into our programming and what the type of work we're doing is we have a newsletter where we educate staff about different types of climate action and library initiatives. But one such example is we've been educating staff and our community members about a local Indigenous group that is working on a land back claim. So local government is trying to sell Indigenous land to developers. And this land is integral to the biodiversity of our area. And also it's a very flood prone area. And so, the Indigenous folks have been defending this land in legal battles for some time. And they could really use help from other community members, kind of lending our support and our voices to say, like, this is, first of all, illegal. This land doesn't belong to you to sell to developers. And then second, what are the costs? Not only to the Indigenous people who are the stewards of this land, but to our local environment for if this land were to be developed. Another example is a local Six Nations group really nearby McMaster doesn't have access to clean drinking water. And so any kind of programs or education around this kind of climate action would be another example of like looking to the local community and what their needs are, and then kind of basing our programming or education around supporting that as best as possible to make our own kind of local community more climate resilient and to uphold the tenets of climate justice. So, as a last resort, I know many of us work in libraries that are already maybe you've already done some work mapping what your library is doing to the UN SDGs. And if that is something that you're doing, again, just because you've already invested the time in doing this kind of mapping work, or maybe your institution has it embedded into the curriculum, I know mine does in some cases, what we can do is to be more specific or as specific as possible. So in the language of refusal, this would be called a third space, which is to say, I'll participate, but not exactly as you want me to. And so in this case, what we could do is go beyond the goal level. So if we think of each of the 17 UN SDGs, within each of those goals, there are specific targets. So if you were to focus on target level activity and then have your measurements or your assessments be directly tied to each of those target levels. And that's one way that we can try to make sure that the impact of the work that we're doing is the most community oriented that it can be, and the most related to our local areas. Okay, so in conclusion, there are some benefits to adopting the UN SDGs and other similar forms of growth-based assessment, but really we need to think about solutions that are based on degrowth that go beyond short-term thinking. So again, thinking that the UN SDGs are the 2030 agenda, and we're coming up closer and closer on that. But when we look at something like, for instance, Indigenous knowledges, or something like even true cost accounting that has been around for, I think, 50 plus years now in an agricultural context. These types of intergenerational systems are based on degrowth, and it can be a way that we can change our thinking about assessment. So again, in the library context at least, and in our own personal spheres of influence, we can try to avert the worst possible outcomes of the climate crisis. Most of all, the assessments that I've highlighted today are intersectional, they're restorative, and they're socially just ways that we can enact change. And before I finish and I turn it over to comments and questions, I just want to acknowledge, I think Morgan's here. I think I saw Morgan in the chat. Thank you to Morgan Barker for encouraging my initial doubts of the UN SDGs and for the conversation that prompted me to explore alternatives, such as those used by Morgan and her colleagues at Cal Poly Humboldt. So maybe Morgan will share more in the chat, because Morgan's already been, I know, been doing this work for years. So thank you very much to Morgan. And without further ado, I'll turn it over. Oh, here's some of my resources, my references as well. I know this is recorded as well, so I'm not going to leave this screen up too long, but know that you can access it later and screenshot it, and or you can send me an email and I'll send them to you if you'd like to do some more reading. And I'll open it up to questions now. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much, Nicole. This was so useful. I hope others got something out of it. As we've said in the chat, please go ahead and share some questions. We would love to hear from you.
I see one question coming in from Brianna. How do you handle pushback from administrators in presenting these methods?
Great question, Brianna. I'm really, really fortunate that my administrators in my library at McMaster Libraries are so incredibly supportive. My university librarian, who's I think otherwise known as the dean of the libraries, would be called it at other institutions, like really gets it and has. I mean, the committee started out like in the pandemic, so it wasn't like we had a ton of support like right from the very beginning, but particularly in the last couple of years, they've really encouraged and supported our work as much as possible. But I can say I've struggled in the larger institutional context of administration, where a lot of the work is for instance, talking about stars and thinking about institutional ratings about things, it can be really hard to access that information, or when some of the information that we're looking for is related to facilities and that's not directly owned by the libraries, it's owned by like the larger kind of campus facilities. So things that we've tried to change related to like printing or scanning or things like that, we just haven't really been able to do. And it's really challenging, but one of the ways that we've kind of worked around it is to just, again, think of our scope of influence. So for the case of like printing and scanning and the changes we were trying to make there, once it became apparent that we were spending so much of our time trying to surpass a problem that we couldn't, we were getting nowhere with, we were like, okay, let's redirect our effort and energy elsewhere. This isn't the only thing we can be doing. What are other things that we can do that we can kind of gain more traction with? So that's one thing. And I think the other thing, and I actually talked to Sarah Tribalhorn about this, who I think is another participant who was here at one point, but I talked to Sarah about it last year at the ARL President's Institute, which is that when we can document the work that we are doing in the literature, it's so helpful to point to it and say, like, look at XYZ other library doing this work, because administrators often kind of speak this language of competition. And so if we can leverage that competition in a way that lends credence to the work that we're doing, I think that's pretty helpful too. So I think, yeah, looking to the literature, and then also if you are doing this work, try and put it into the literature as much as possible, so we can kind of invite each other in as kind of like bolstering our arguments, I think.
And we still have quite a bit of question coming in. That's great. So the next one is from Jacqueline. How do we make this relevant to patrons?
That's a great question too. So I think we can, again, I think it depends on our individual library context. I can speak from my example of working at our like in an academic library. We have we don't have a web page, but we have a LibGuide related to sustainability. And on that LibGuide, we share information about what we're doing. But I think there's this work that we're always constantly doing in the library of like, you know, we understand the foundational or like the theoretical parts of it, but we don't really need our patrons to understand it in the same way that we do, as long as they're kind of getting the message. So for instance, I'm a teaching and learning librarian, and a lot of my work in teaching is focused around the framework for information literacy, the ACRL framework for information literacy. And so there's these 6 frames. But when I teach, I'm not often telling students or even faculty members, like, here are the frames, and that's why I'm teaching you this. I'm kind of just doing the teaching, and they understand, you know, like what the learning outcomes or the learning objectives are. And so I kind of think about our sustainability work in a similar way. So for instance, we have a seed library. And for the seed library, we're kind of upholding these kind of tenets of degrowth, where like we're you know, talking to Indigenous groups to have information about like what are the seeds used historically in an area, what are seeds that they would like to see that are incorporated into the seed library. We also have the ways that we're having like the metric for the seed library aren't like solely based on quantities of seeds that are shared, but also adding other dimensions of like, you know, X amount of seeds were returned, or here are the, you know, the community garden that had learning objectives associated with the seeds that they borrowed from the garden, et cetera. And so it's kind of adding dimension in beyond like the numerical of like every year our seed library has grown. And so there's other kind of ways that we can think about it that are not, you know, again, we don't have to necessarily make the theoretical side explicit to patrons. I think as long as we're focused on like what our objectives are, and then again, using it as a tool to talk about our impact in the ways that we're observing by, you know, this reflection. I hope that makes sense.
And then we have a question in the Q&A, and it's from Elaine. What kind of reactions to the idea of degrowth do you have encountered? What about reaction to the anti-capitalist nature of degrowth?
Yeah, it's kind of, that's a good question. I remember when I first started thinking about this, the first person I had this conversation with was my father, because he's like really like based on like like a traditional economic capitalism is the only system that can work kind of mindset. And so um I when I kind of like was I knew I would get a lot of pushback from him. So he's who I kind of practiced my my arguments on, and he could kind of see the logic of it. Another way that I like to frame it to people who like, you know, might not drink the Kool-Aid as much as I do necessarily, but thinking about like microdosing degrowth a little bit. So for instance, one of the things that our sustainability committee did this year, in Canada, we have Climate Action Week in November, and we did a delete-a-thon. And so the idea was just inviting our colleagues and inviting the campus community to like go through and delete items in our cloud storage. And even if that makes even if it made a very, very small change in the actual growth, what I was hoping it would do would be to make people aware of this idea that like, you know, we think of our phones and we think of our computers and our storage systems as having this like infinite growth without actually being aware of the energy associated with maintaining those systems. And so inviting people to think of like, yeah, all this stuff is piling up and piling up, and thinking about like the material impacts of that kind of thing. So those are some ways that I think we can invite people to think about degrowth in very, very small and manageable ways to their life. You know, like some people might not be ready to give up Amazon or to, you know, like take cold showers or only buy secondhand or, you know, do things that are like, you know, really meaningfully we probably have to think about doing at a societal level. But if we can even shift the thinking a little bit towards that, maybe we can normalize it a little bit, even for future generations, I think. Yeah.
Awesome. We have one more question from Peter. One dimension that I want to think more about is how much of the climate impact of library operations is generated by our vendors, who might not be willing to share information with us. For libraries with unique digital collection, whether in special collection, institutional repositories, or data repositories, for example, cloud vendors can be a big part of our infrastructure. Any ideas about how to get information about assessing and reducing impact of this dimension of libraries?
Yes, I'm actually going to share an article in the chat. And I was actually going to share this with the IFLA organizers as well, with Beth and Vivian, if they're looking for ideas for future presenters. So one of my colleagues at McMaster, Paige Roman, worked previously at Western in another university in Canada. And they did this really great research project. They're collections librarians. And they basically came up with a template, which they called a green audit template, which is also available actually on another webpage. I'll find the link and I'll share it in the chat as well. And this basically, similar to what you said, you know, they mentioned that there's some parts of what vendors are doing that is obscured to us intentionally. But the idea is, I think, similar. I'm not a collections librarian, but similar to the idea of like kind of being more transparent about like what our big deals are, and ways that we can kind of like leverage the financial sides of collections. If we can do the same thing with noting and publicizing what we do know about our vendors' initiatives related to environmental sustainability and climate action, then we can kind of maybe try and tip the power in our favor a little bit more to say like, okay, well, we have a choice between A or B. If we have the choice and we know option B is the more environmentally sustainable option, we're going to go with that. I know some administrators at my institution have thought about that, but the leverage hasn't quite been there yet. But I think, again, if it's something that we can kind of do in libraries, I know actually there was a similar project happening in Canada in public libraries as well. And so again, if we can kind of keep doing this work, keep publicizing the work that we're doing, and then sharing these resources, then we can kind of hopefully make this like kind of a standard part of the conversation we have with our vendors as well, and get some more power there in that. And oh yeah, thanks Beth for sharing the link. So the Green Audit Project link that's shared in the chat there is the project information, and it also includes the template as well that the authors are hoping other people will implement in their own kind of collections decisions. So yeah.
All right, I think you've answered all the questions, and we're at the end of the hour. That was so informative. I hope everyone attending got a lot out of it and some great resources to follow up. And you've saw Nicole's email if you want to reach out. So we will we will get the recording up and the slides so we can share those out. And that link takes you to where we'll be posting the webinar series information afterwards. So please talk to your colleagues and follow up with some of this great information, and then consider joining us for another webinar in the future. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Nicole and Vivian, for today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.